City's annual Indigenous Peoples Day event. I am just so thrilled to see this many individuals joining us today. Some of you may have joined us earlier today when we had an earlier guest speaker. And at this session this afternoon, we have a new guest speaker joining us. I just want to give a warm welcome to you all and just say that on this Indigenous Peoples Day, unlike others, I will refrain from doing the land acknowledgement. Instead, I ask that you take the time to not only deeply reflect, but also to commit to action that will move our world back into balance. We see all around us a world out of balance. Currently, there are hurricanes raging and battering Florida, and the continuous wars and degradation of life on our planet. Indigenous knowledge is not just a talking point, a vibe, or a theoretical framework. It is about actively building relationships and kinship to all that exists, everything seen and unseen. Let us use this day to think about how Indigenous worldviews may inform our collective action, not tomorrow, but today. Consider the type of ancestor you will be for future descendants. What have you left undone that needs doing? With whom do you need to build bridges or make amends? Ask yourself, how much does your psychic presence with others weigh? Are you light or are you heavy? Do you require extra lifting from others? Or are you an individual who can lift others up? When you enter a room or space, do you enter gracefully and leave gracefully? What condition do you leave others once you leave the room? Reflecting on these questions allows us to return to our original instructions as human beings, that being in relationship is what matters the most. May these conversations today be a spark for further action. So thank you for letting me share some thoughts on Indigenous Peoples Day. And at this time, please allow me to introduce to you our very special guest, Dr. Lara Jacobs. Dr. Jacobs is a citizen of the Muscogee Nation and has Choctaw heritage. She earned her Ph.D. in Forest Ecosystems and Society from Oregon State University and has a master's degree in environmental studies from Prescott College and a Bachelor of Science degree in women's studies from Oregon State University. Dr. Jacobs is a complex systems scientist who focuses on how outdoor recreation activities in tribal treaty lands can create ecological and pathogenic impacts on tribal communities. She also studies traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous value systems, climate change, STEM education, and co-equity-based management paradigms in the context of Indigenous peoples' rights. We are very honored to have her join us today, and at this time, I am turning the floor over to you, Dr. Jacobs.
Thank you, Meadow, so much, Dr. Davis White Eyes. I appreciate your generous introduction and your beautiful statement that you introduced this meeting with. I am very grateful to be here with everyone today. I want to talk to you about an upcoming book called Indigenous Critical Reflections on Traditional Ecological Knowledge. This book was a labor of love that brought together so many different people and so many knowledges so that we could produce it. And it will be published in spring of next year by Oregon State University Press. Heshche, Dr. Lara Jacobs, Chohojifkados, Muscogee Moroyes, Aholegogedoyes, Chatasia Hoki, Estangon. Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Lara Jacobs. I'm a citizen of Muscogee Creek Nation. I also have Choctaw heritage. I'm in the potato clan of my tribe. My people came from Coweta tribal town, and it was situated on the banks of the Chattahoochee River, which is right in between Alabama and Georgia. And our homeland spanned from Alabama to Georgia to Florida and into the Carolinas before colonization. And before we were forcibly removed to Indian Territory, or what we commonly refer to as Oklahoma today. And our people are still thriving and still doing their best to create futures for the rest of our peoples and the rest of our kin, including our more than human kin, like our plants and animal relations. Dr. Allison Davis Whiteeyes has given an amazing introduction to me already, but you can see on this slide that I have a PhD in forest ecosystems and society, and she already described very thoroughly the types of science that I do. I'm also a postdoctoral research associate right now at Michigan State University. So a little bit about what we're going to discuss today, or just in this presentation. The first thing I want to do is give gratitude for land stewards. And like Dr. Davis Whiteeyes, I'm not a huge fan of land acknowledgements, and I don't think we need to be doing those right now, but I still feel very much in my soul as an Indigenous woman that it's my responsibility to give gratitude to the people who are still caretaking the lands in the face of colonialism and climate change and all of the things that we are facing today. And then I want to take more of an Indigenous approach to this book talk. And I want to talk story with you about the book and tell you how it was created and who the people are that were involved in it. So I'll talk a little bit about the purpose and the background of the book, and then I'll get into defining what traditional ecological knowledge actually is from an Indigenous perspective. And then I'll talk to you about 3 key Indigenous value systems that are really guiding the focus of this book. And then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So land. A very incredible Indigenous woman named Patty Krawiec, and she's also the author of a book called Becoming Kin, has a quote that says, "We are people of the land, an interrelated people, a human family called to live in relationship with the land and each other." Leanne Simpson has another quote from her book, who's both of these books, by the way, I highly recommend. The book's called As We Have Always Done. And she speaks of land in a different way. And she says, our stories take place in the context of the land. The land is both context and process. It's how we store our memories, our stories, and our knowledge. It's how we experience our lives. It's a relationship. And you can see by both of these quotes, we're starting to talk about values of land and how different Indigenous peoples think about land and our relations and our responsibilities to them. And you can even see in this image here. So most of the imagery in this presentation, by the way, is created by my son, Rode Grayson. And he's an incredible artist. And he actually did the book cover too for the book. And so, yeah, I give my thanks to him as well. But I also have a lot of gratitude for the people's lands that I've been on, that I'm a guest on up here in Central Oregon. Now, when I started working on this book back in, I think about 2021, I was living actually on the Oregon coast. And so no matter where I'm at in time and space, I always think about the people who are tending these lands, who have since time immemorial, and who will continue to do that into the future. And so I want to give gratitude for the Alsea peoples, the Kalapuya peoples, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla peoples for all that they do for our ecosystems and to ensure that these lands are taken care of responsibly, relationally, and through reciprocity through time. These lands hold deep histories that are rich with cultural knowledge, with Indigenous knowledges, that are rich with relationships and stewardship that, like I said, they continue to thrive today. And I have to give gratitude, no matter whose lands I'm on, for the care and the connection that these peoples have to their lands, which provided the space for all of this work in this book to come together. But I also want to say that this book is really a global book, and the knowledge and insights that are shared in the book are shaped by and rooted in the lands of not just these people, but so many other Indigenous peoples from around the world. And these peoples have resilience and wisdom that continue to guide the future and sustainability of our world. And I'm just very grateful and humbled every time I get to traverse new lands and learn more about the peoples who have been there since time immemorial, stewarding them. So let's talk story. Let's talk a little bit about the book. When I think about where this book idea began, I have to rewind the clock a little bit. I started my PhD at Oregon State University in 2019. I was on campus and I was so excited to be an Indigenous woman on campus. And then I found out that I was the only Indigenous person in the College of Forestry as a graduate student. And I started to build bridges to find my community on campus, as many Indigenous peoples do as students. And I found Indigenous peoples all around me, and we built such beautiful community together that we've maintained through time. And one of the things that I started to find out as a graduate student who was trying to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into my research was that we didn't have any classes that we could take as graduate students at the time. They have since rectified that, though, which I'm happy about. And so I decided that some of these Indigenous peoples and our allies should get together. And we co-founded a club called the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Club. And I was the president of that club for multiple years. And in the process, we created this really beautiful space together where we could come together and talk about traditional ecological knowledge. We could read through the literature. We could critically analyze the literature and the lenses through which these topics were being written. Like, who was writing these? From what lens are they writing from? Especially when they're being written by non-Indigenous peoples. And so we started to really see in the literature that a lot of the TEK literature was not written by Indigenous peoples. A lot of the books were not written by Indigenous peoples. And we noticed the gap. And so we wanted to bring Indigenous peoples together in a very large effort to hear their stories, to hear their perspectives, to do workshops, and to bring even elders and tribal governments and things like that into discussion about what traditional ecological knowledge is as an opportunity to learn. And so we planned and facilitated the Traditional Ecological Knowledge National Virtual Summit. It was supposed to happen in 2010, and then the pandemic hit. And so we had to cancel it. And then we decided, well, canceling it is good because it's going to give us the opportunity to build it larger. And when we did, we decided that we were going to do a big national thing and create and make sure that it was virtual so that we can eliminate any types of barriers that people might have to having to travel to attend. So we could also minimize their carbon budget for travel. So the purpose of this summit was to center Indigenous peoples and tribal voices, and to center traditional ecological knowledge into the focus of what we were doing, and then also to incorporate Indigenous value systems of relationships, responsibility, and reciprocity into these discussions. And so it took place over 3 days. Each day had a different theme, which was guided by one of the Indigenous value systems. And we ended up having over 1,000 attendees per day from across the world. So what we thought was going to be a national virtual summit actually turned into more of an international effort. And the White House actually got involved because when we were doing the advertising, they were also in the process of trying to form their Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge policies. And so they were going around the country and they were trying to understand the voices and concerns of Indigenous peoples about traditional ecological knowledge before they created new policies that had those as the focus. And so I was very excited to have them in attendance and to help moderate one of their White House listening sessions during the summit, because it gave me the opportunity to listen and to learn and to know what Indigenous peoples were saying about traditional ecological knowledge, about their concerns about what the government is doing with our knowledges, and what new policies might do to influence the taking of our knowledges from our communities. And it was a powerful, powerful session. And we also had things like ceremonial blessings for this conference that I'm still very grateful for from local tribal members. And then we also had writing groups. So Indigenous peoples were invited to to be a part of these writing groups so that they could reflect on each of the value systems and the knowledge that they were learning, the labor that people were sharing with them from their communities during this workshop. And what I initially intended was for those writing groups to produce manuscripts that we would put into a journal. And then everything changed pretty quickly. But I had a lot of lessons and a lot of key takeaways from that conference. And really, these are them. We know that Indigenous peoples are very highly concerned about what's happening to their traditional ecological knowledges by academic institutions, by governmental entities, and even by nonprofits. Anyone who comes into our communities and wants to know our knowledges, Indigenous peoples are concerned about that. Indigenous value systems, the three ones that I've listed, they're talked about very widely in the scientific literature, but they're related. We all carry these with us, but they're also very super distinct between communities and sometimes even within communities. We also know that there's not really any books that really capture these insights, nor center only Indigenous peoples as the primary people who are talking about these things. So I sat back and I thought about how can we capture these critical issues in a way that provides solutions. And so I talked to a journal, and I had a journal on board, and they were like, we want to publish this. This would be amazing. We could do a special issue. But there's problems sometimes with journals too, because they'll put your work behind a paywall. And we wanted this to be more accessible. And, Indigenous peoples want to read Indigenous people's work. And sometimes the scientific literature mitigates that. And people aren't going into the scholarly literature from our communities all the time to go find our work. But a book is something that gets published widely. And although it does have costs associated with it as well, I spoke with Oregon State University Press, and they were very excited because they have a huge environmental focus on how on what they publish. And I told them from the very beginning, if I come to you and we do this project, it has to be an all Indigenous approach. The book has to be written by and illustrated by and edited by and peer reviewed exclusively by Indigenous peoples. I want to start normalizing that we can talk about our knowledges as us, by us, and for us. And they were very excited about this. And I also wrote out a proposal that focused on centering traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous value systems and our critical thinking about how our knowledges are used, how they're extracted, and what we're doing in our communities to protect them. So what are the solutions we have? Because Indigenous peoples have genius inside of our communities, and we're very solution oriented. So as a response to that, I ended up signing a contract with OSU Press. And the purpose of our book is really, it was created as a response to the concerns from all of these Indigenous peoples about the appropriation and the misuse of our knowledges by academic and governmental entities. In this book, we provide a platform for Indigenous peoples to lead critical discourse on traditional ecological knowledge and our Indigenous value systems on our own terms, in our own voices, through different formats of sharing knowledge. We also address gaps in the literature that I already mentioned by creating a space solely for Indigenous voices to discuss traditional ecological knowledge and its broader significance. And we bring a focus on Indigenous-led solution-driven approaches to protecting our knowledges, to protecting our sovereignty and our environmental stewardship. The audience of the book. In the introduction chapter of the book, I wrote that this book is not for the white gaze, that this book is a responsibility that I'm carrying as an Indigenous woman and that my community is expecting me to bring to write authentically and responsibly for our people as our people. And so, although this is not specifically written for the general public, we hope for a wide audience. We hope that people will read this book anyways to learn from us in a different way. So we're not performing in this book. We're writing authentically. So our audience is really Indigenous communities who are reclaiming their knowledge and advocating for cultural and environmental sovereignty. This is a perfect book for students, for universities, for academics, for tribal nations, for policymakers, anyone at all, even nonprofits who are seeking to engage deeply with Indigenous perspectives on our own knowledge systems. Our non-Indigenous allies, and I know there are many amazing people out there who get that label, they're also part of our audience. The people who support decolonization especially, and want to understand Indigenous-led environmental and cultural stewardship as we explain it. The structure of the book is very largely based on the conference, actually. So it has three main sections, and it's organized around the three Indigenous value systems of relationships, reciprocity, and responsibility. Each section of the book begins with poetry, and then it's followed by an essay from the TEK Summit's writing group, and then it includes lots of different forms of sharing knowledge, including storytelling and different academic chapters and different types of essays. Each of the chapters within the book begins with positionality statements, because it's how we also introduce ourselves as Indigenous peoples. We declare our relations to our Indigenous communities and to our lands. And it's a way also to hold people accountable for the communities that they come from and the knowledges that they're speaking from and the lenses that they're bringing to those chapters. So you will know exactly who's writing what, where they're from, whose lands they're on when they're writing these chapters. And it's a large book. It's not a small book. It has 27 chapters, including the introduction. And I think it's somewhere around 500 pages. So it's a good read. Now, the contributors. Now, when I say this is our book, this is not just my book. I edited, I compiled the book. I have some chapters in there myself. But this book features the voices of 51 contributors from 59 tribal nations or Indigenous communities and cultures from around the world. So it's not just located to North America. We have people also who are writing from Japan. We have an author who is Siberian Yupik. We have people from New Zealand, from South America. We did not get every country. We didn't want to do a checkmark approach to inclusion. We just opened the door widely for as many people as we could fit in here to get together and bring these knowledges to the general public. Our contributors included tribal governmental officials, community cultural leaders, elders, activists, poets, and both early career and established Indigenous scholars. So we're also decolonizing who can talk about our knowledges in these academic books. It's not just people who have PhDs or master's degrees, it's our community people, the people who we consider our wisdom holders. And the diversity of voices ensures that the book addresses a wide spectrum of topics, from land and water protection to cultural preservation to Indigenous data sovereignty and decolonization. Unlike many edited volumes, this book ensured that all of our contributors were compensated for their work, and Oregon State University Press was incredible to work with for this purpose. Most edited volumes, when you have multiple authors throughout a book, they don't pay the contributors, but Oregon University Press did, so we could make sure that their labors were acknowledged through payment. This decision really reflects the book's commitment also to Indigenous sovereignty and to respect the labor of our peoples and our wisdom. The contributors shared their expertise, their stories, their resistance, with the understanding that their voices are central to the solutions needed to address a wide array of challenges, and many of those are environmental, and some of those are structural and systemic issues that we're facing in the academy and with governments and things like that. This is our book. These contributors right here, these amazing peoples made this possible, and they worked with me for so many years to put this beautiful piece of knowledge together. And you'll see if you look at this list quickly, you might recognize a few names like Joy Harjo, who is the US Poet Laureate. And she has been, I think she was a two-time Poet Laureate for the United States. And you might notice Jessica Hernandez, who's the author of Fresh Banana Leaves, which is another really amazing Indigenous book. And you might notice some other names on here, but equally important, all of these people brought so much knowledge and energy to this book that make it such a masterpiece for what we were trying to do. So now that I've told you about the book, what am I talking about? For people who don't know what traditional ecological knowledge is, let's chat about this. Let's chat through it. From an academic standpoint, traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, is a term that was created by Western scientists because Indigenous peoples have always been studied by Western science. And they didn't understand what we were doing. They didn't know what to call it. They're like, how do we describe what these Indigenous peoples are doing? How do we understand their life ways and how they understand what they're doing? Because it's different than Western science. So they needed a label to put on it. So they called it traditional ecological knowledge. And they created this to understand the knowledge that Indigenous peoples are carrying with them in their communities about lands that they have stewarded since time immemorial, and then all of the ecosystems in their place-based societies. Now, TEK, it's important to know this, reflects only a portion of the types of knowledges that Indigenous peoples hold, but it is a very relational type of knowledge that is connected to other knowledge systems. This term, though, it's a super academic term. It's used by academics and nonprofits and policymakers and governments. But if I go into my community and I talk to my ceremonial elders and I say, let's talk about TEK, they're going to look at me kind of funny because that is not the way that we describe our knowledge. We just say, this is what we know. This is our knowledge. These are our ways of being. Now, when I talk about knowledge, if you look in the literature and you look at how non-Indigenous peoples talk about TEK, they call it an epistemology, a way of knowing, a knowledge system, but it's not. And so in the introduction chapter, I went through the literature, but I went through specifically looking for Indigenous literature on TEK. And there's a lot of it that should be cited more, I will say that. And when you put all of the pieces together and all of the Indigenous brilliance that has formed this literature as us, by us, for us, as Indigenous peoples, we see that traditional ecological knowledge isn't just an epistemology. It is a knowledge, belief, practice system. For knowledge, of course, it has empirical observations and understandings of ecosystems that have been developed over generations and passed down generationally through different processes that include the lived experiences and the deep, close interactions that Indigenous peoples have with their local place-based environments. As a belief system, TEK also incorporates the spiritual and cultural beliefs and the cosmologies that guide Indigenous peoples' relationships with land, water, and our more than human kin, which include our plants and animals and other beings in this world. Now, as a system of practice, it's the application of the knowledge and the beliefs through sustainable community-based practices that ensure the health of the ecosystems and then all of our relations. So TEK is not just a knowledge system, it is a knowledge, belief, practice system. And when we talk about it, that's what we're trying to say. For Indigenous values, if you look in the literature, there's a lot of literature on this, and it's been going on for years. There's what they call the 4 Rs. There's also how people have expanded it into 7 Rs and 8 Rs, and there's a lot of them. And when we talk about Indigenous value systems, we usually create these big umbrella terms like relationships. And like I said about that conference, one thing I learned is that the way that we describe them broadly is really dismissive of the distinctions that happen within our communities, and then even across communities about how relationships are honored and how they work through our communities. So in the context of TEK, relationships emphasize the interconnection between all living beings and the land generally. And these connections are ecological, they're spiritual, they're cultural, and they recognize land and more than human kin as active participants in sustaining all lifeways. But if you think about how many Indigenous peoples and cultures exist, and you think about the differences in our environments, and you think of the differences in our cultures and our languages and our origin stories and our religions or our cosmologies, they all bring these differences in how relationships matter and how they're operationalized. So the book challenges readers to really understand TEK as a knowledge belief practice system, where these diversities of relationships guide ecological stewardship and cultural survival. If we think about reciprocity as an Indigenous value system, and we link it into TEK, then it involves this balance, this give and take that sustains all life, where humans must offer care and stewardship and responsibility back to the land and all of its beings. Reciprocity is an ethical framework that guides sustainable practices and ensures that the land's generosity is met with gratitude and responsible stewardship, which is another reason why I began this presentation with my gratitude to the land stewards, because that's part of it. That's part of my responsibility and my systems of reciprocity as a Muscogee woman. Now, this approach extends traditional ecological knowledge as something beyond just scientific observations, beyond just a knowledge system. And it frames it as a holistic system that involves understanding and acting. So the practice point, right? In ways that honor the gratitude that we have for all of our relations. Responsibility, when we link it to TEK, refers to the obligations that we have to protect, to nurture, and to sustain the land and our cultural practices, which are deeply integrated for future generations. One thing about responsibility that we have to understand when we come from Indigenous communities, or we're thinking about how responsibility works, a lot of these value systems are tied directly to our origin stories that tell us the beings we're in relationship with, our clan systems, our kinship systems. They talk about our relationality. They talk about the reciprocal processes that occur in this world when we are responsibly and relationally involved as we're supposed to do as Indigenous peoples. So this value system informs how knowledge is shared and used, and emphasizes that actions must benefit the broader community. It's not just about us, it's about the whole community. And when I say community, not just people, our living community on this planet in our ecosystems. The book advocates also for TEK as a system of accountability, where Indigenous peoples hold the responsibility that was given to us in our origin stories and by our clan responsibilities and everything else, which are super different from clan to clan within a tribe, and of course, very distinct across Indigenous cultures. But those responsibilities we have are to steward both our knowledges, to pass those down generationally, and then to steward the land and our more than human kin in culturally appropriate ways. So this book has 27 chapters. And when I thought about this presentation, I sat there and went, how do I choose some to talk about? Because that's what I'm supposed to do in a book talk. I'm supposed to talk to you about what's in the book. And it's impossible. And I keep adding on things every time I look at this list. So this is just a glimpse of the book. And there's so much beauty and knowledge in here that I can't capture in the time we need to talk about the book. But I can tell you about a few of them. So the introduction, I wrote this with one of my ceremonial leaders from my tribe, and with an elder, and with two other general Muscogee people. And this introduction, if you ever read my work, by the way, you'll notice I don't talk about my people a lot because I know my positionality and I know my place in my tribe. I am not a speaker for my people. But when I do write about my people, like I do in this chapter with my people, we make sure we have these cultural protocols in place that we're following so that the information that we are sharing is highly vetted, that it's coming from our ceremonial elders, and that it's true and accurate as best as we can make it. And so that introduction sets the stage for everyone to understand traditional ecological knowledge, and it explains the three Indigenous value systems of relationships, reciprocity, and responsibility, but we do it through a Muscogee cultural lens. So it provides this good case study for you to see in the introduction how this works with one community. And we talk a lot about our history over time in doing so in the most respectful way that we could. But this book also doesn't offer any sacred information to anyone. So if you're looking for little sprinkles of sacred data, this book is not the place to look. There's another really good chapter by Pat Rogers Gonzalez, who used to be the executive director for Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, and now he's over at Yale. It's called The Doctrine of Discovery Still Lives With Us, and It Ain't Good. This chapter offers an in-depth historical and legal analysis of the doctrine of discovery, and it explains its enduring impacts on Indigenous sovereignty and land rights, while connecting this history to contemporary struggles for land management and co-management practices. The director of the Swinomish Tribe's Environmental Protection Department, Todd Mitchell, wrote a chapter called Swinomish Perspectives on Place-Based Science, Culture, and Environmental Education, an Indigenous approach to environmental and resource issues. And this is really a beautiful case study chapter of what the tribe is doing to integrate cultural values and TEK into science education and into their environmental management. And it serves as this model for place-based learning and for just natural resource management in general. A different chapter is called The Responsibility of Relational Consideration, Invasive and Non-Native Species in the Context of Indigenous Food Security and Food Sovereignty in a Changing Climate. And this was written by Dr. Jennifer Grenz from the University of British Columbia. This chapter investigates the connections between invasive species and colonialism, while focusing on restoration efforts that support Indigenous food security, sovereignty, and the healing of relationships with land. And one thing I find particularly interesting about Dr. Grenz's work is the way she takes a look at our colonial ways of talking about species that we call invasive, and how some of those species are actually helping like our like bees and other pollinators to exist, and how they have changed her medicine basket each year as she goes out to collect medicines. And she asks people to look at invasive species in a different way, instead of just like as these invaders, because that's colonial language. It's not Indigenous relations or relationality. There's another chapter called Honoring Our Responsibilities with Doing Science, Indigenous Scientist Perspectives. And this chapter has a lot of authors on it, including Dr. Jessica Hernandez, who wrote Fresh Banana Leaves, the book I showed you a little while ago. This chapter examines the ethical dimensions of research within Indigenous communities, and it emphasizes cultural values and ethical practices. A different chapter that was written by an Indigenous Samoan woman is called Talofe, Your Ancestors Are Gossiping About Your Data Management Plan. And this chapter is just a beautiful chapter that critiques contemporary data management practices through her Indigenous communities' lenses, and emphasizes the need for Indigenous data sovereignty and culturally respectful approaches that are guided by ancestral values and responsibilities for managing and sharing data. And she actually goes out and even talks about, like, what are you doing out in the field, and how are you honoring the cultural protocols when you're collecting samples, like sand samples or like plant samples and things like that? How can you be responsible to Indigenous peoples while you're doing that? And I think that takes Indigenous data sovereignty and research protocols in a whole different direction than many people have ever even considered. And then there is a chapter that I authored with a lot of folks who are just globally, just around the globe, called A Critical Declaration of Decolonization and Indigenization for Scientific Research in the Academy. And like I said, this has a lot of voices in it. And we provide a powerful critique of colonial practices in scientific research and academic practices. And we outline specific steps. We have a whole declaration at the end of this chapter to shift power dynamics to a place where we can recognize Indigenous data sovereignty and prioritize Indigenous leadership in anything related to the extractions of our knowledges, and prioritize culturally grounded approaches to knowledge production. So this chapter is specifically for researchers, for research funders, and for journals. We have a lot of guidelines that as an Indigenous community, we're asking people to consider. Another chapter is called Reciprocal Sovereignty, Traditional Ecological Knowledge, and a Commonwealth of Ecological Dignity. And this was written by Joseph Gazing-Wolf. It explores the concept of reciprocal sovereignty, where TEK supports mutual respect and shared responsibility between humans and the natural world, thereby promoting ecological dignity and sustainable stewardship. And Joseph really gets into the rights of nature in this chapter. And it's just, for folks who don't know him, go look him up, find him on YouTube and everything. He's like a philosopher and just a really gorgeous human and an amazing thinker that inspires lots of people. Another chapter is called Co-Production of Knowledge in Arctic Research, a Paradigm Shift or Another Cycle of Oppression. And in this chapter, Margaret Rudolph challenges the rhetoric of co-production in Arctic research by exposing how it often perpetuates colonial power dynamics. This chapter calls for a true shift toward Indigenous-led approaches that prioritize sovereignty and equality in knowledge creation. So she's really taking a look at like how the co-production of Indigenous Native Alaskans traditional ecological knowledge is not really being done in ethical ways and create solutions that we can use to move forward. The next chapter is Geoscience Obligations to Decolonization, an Awi methodology of Makahana Limukaikia in Ainu Monsieur. So this is by Dr. Andrew Kalani Carlson, and it calls for a fundamental shift in geoscience by grounding research in Indigenous methodologies that emphasize positionality. So who are you as a researcher? And the beautiful thing about this chapter is that Dr. Carlson, as an Indigenous researcher, asks himself this question: what is my standpoint? What is my positionality working with Indigenous peoples in Japan here? And how does that influence the lenses that we're using in our sciences? So he's looking at how the obligations of researchers and what they have to their communities and the lands they study through a methodology that he's created. The chapter underscores the need to decolonize academic practices by centering Indigenous sovereignty, cultural values, and reciprocal relations, and challenges researchers to confront and dismantle colonial frameworks in their work. Pyroepistemology, reclaiming and reciprocity is another beautiful chapter that looks at the integration of Indigenous fire knowledge as an epistemology within academic spaces and emphasizes the healing power of fire to cleanse colonized environments and restore a holistic growth. So she's looking at cultural fire as this cleansing process for academia and advocates for decolonizing educational practices by weaving together our ancestral knowledges, our spirituality, and our cultural resilience to create space for transformative learning and healing. And I know I'm getting close to time here, so I'm gonna pick out one more of these. A Caring Upheaval, Transnational Abolition as a Pathway to More Reciprocal Futures is written by Dr. Jonathan Fisk, and he is Indigenous to Puerto Rico, so he's Taino. And he's advocating in this chapter for intertwining abolition with Indigenous principles of reciprocity in TEK and challenges reformist approaches that fail to dismantle oppressive systems. The chapter emphasizes the need for transnational solidarity, land reclamation, and the reinstitution of reciprocal relations as essential components of cultivating liberated and ecologically sustainable futures. And for those who are watching this on the recording, just pause and read the rest of the slide. So I have some aspirations for this book. I have some hopes because, like I said, it's been a labor of love. And these aren't just my hopes and dreams. These are also the dreams of many of the co-authors in this book who've shared their knowledges. We want to empower Indigenous communities to reclaim and protect their knowledges, their cultures, and their lands. We want to challenge and transform colonial narratives in academia, in environmental policy, and in land management. And we want to inspire meaningful actions toward decolonization, Indigenous sovereignty, and the Indigenous-led environmental justice movements globally. We want to create a resource, and we're hoping we have done that will bridge cultural understandings by amplifying Indigenous perspectives for future generations. We also want to encourage non-Indigenous peoples to support Indigenous-led movements and better understand the concepts of TEK and Indigenous value systems, and most importantly, Indigenous leadership in all of these conversations. So Patty Kralweck, the author of Becoming Kin, I gave you a quote at the beginning from her. She issued a blurb for our book. In her review, she says, Indigenous peoples have shared values, but we live them out in ways that reflect the places where our tribes emerged as people and the communities in which we live. Lara Jacobs has created a touchstone in these collected essays and reflections from Indigenous peoples throughout the so-called Americas and beyond, giving voice to the various ways we live out relationships, reciprocity, and responsibility. I will return to these words again and again, and so will you. And as someone who looks up to Patty's work, it was just amazing and humbling to read those words. Now, like I said, this book does not come out until next spring. And so I'm going to encourage you, because there are steps you can take now, to look at some of the authors who have contributed to this book and read and support their individual work as well. So Dr. Jennifer Grenz has her book, Medicine Wheel for the Planet, that just came out this year. And it's already in its third printing in Canada, and it's one of the national bestsellers up there. Not getting much traction yet down in the US, so we need to help her out with that. It's a gorgeous book. Fresh Banana Leaves by Jessica Hernandez. It's incredible. Dr. David Lewis wrote about tribal histories of the Willamette Valley. It's a beautiful book filled with so much knowledge. Dr. Michelle Jacob wrote a book called Yakima Rising, Indigenous Cultural Revitalization, Activism, and Healing. And then Joy Harjo, who's from my tribe, who's just a gorgeous poet. She has so many books. Just Google Joy. She's just a beautiful person, and her words are they're humbling and gorgeous, and will help you reflect a lot about the way we live. So a few closing thoughts here that I want to tell you. The histories of these lands are Indigenous. The lands are still Indigenous today, and the future of these lands are also going to be Indigenous. And I hope that this book and this presentation will inspire you to invest in Indigenous futures. So we're ready for Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Jacobs. If you have questions, comments, please drop them in the chat. And while you're thinking of your question, we have about 10 minutes. I'm just going to say thank you so much, Dr. Jacobs. I think that this book actually brings together in a very holistic way the ways in which the academy, and I think you said it so very well, nonprofits and government agencies should really be approaching Indigenous knowledge. It's speaking to the ethics of community-based research. So I really want to thank you for that. Any questions from our colleagues? Well, while we're waiting for questions, I'd had one that came to my mind. You talk a lot, and I must say I appreciated very much your framing of traditional ecological knowledge as being named by Western scientists. Sometimes we don't know that or don't even think of that. And that naming was, I thought, wow, that makes sense. And then you said something I found very interesting, especially for those of us who are in higher education. You said traditional ecological knowledge is not an epistemology. It is a knowledge, belief, practice system. And I think this is a beautiful conceptual framing. It's very holistic and much more authentic. How did you come to that understanding of all of those things converging into one? Was this from your work with ceremonial leaders? Was this from conversations with community members? Oh, you cannot unmute. There
So
you go.
yes, that it's a beautiful question, and I appreciate that question. It came from many places. It came from talking to my cultural mentors, my ceremonial leaders, and it also came from looking at the literature and understanding how other Indigenous peoples were really talking about different facets of TEK. Like Dr. Nicholas Rio really, in a lot of his scholarship, talks about it as a system of practice. And we know lots of people talk about it as a system of knowledge. And then when I talk to my people, it's also a belief system, and it's tied essentially to our cosmologies, to our spiritualities, to everything we do that's tied back to our origin stories. And so the knowledge came from a lot of different spaces to form that understanding and bring it together in a lens that really challenges people's understandings of it as just a knowledge system.
You're receiving some thanks from people in the audience. They're looking forward to your work and to the book. I know that all of us are. And your son's artwork is well received here at Fielding. I'm curious, as a higher education institution, which, you know, is focused on, as you well know, knowledge production. That's a word we hear as academics all the time. What would you recommend universities be particularly mindful of in working with Indigenous communities? If you had a, I don't want to say list of demands, but certainly a list, what would you say we need to do? What would be your suggestions that higher education really needs to tend to?
It's a long list. It's a very long list. I've spent 14 years in academia just through education and now professionally understanding things from my personal experience, but also from Indigenous peoples who have their own experiences that we bring together in community and discuss quite often. The first thing we need is more investments in Indigenous educators. We need Indigenous peoples teaching these classes about TEK so that they get it right. We need better involvement with the local Indigenous peoples who are surrounding schools so that we aren't conflating TEK as this big umbrella topic and talking about it so generally, but having local communities whose lands people are studying on come in and talk to them about what it really means to them, to these lands. Do you know what I mean? So it needs to be specific and people's based, but also we need to completely restructure the relations and the responsibilities we have in research processes and invest 1000% from every part of the research process, from conception to publication to methodology to even funding. We need to invest in Indigenous leadership through all of those processes, and then also keep investing in Indigenous students because we do exist. There's a lot of us, but we need financial support to make it through all of the barriers that academia presents and all of the biases we have to sit through in our classes as we're learning about Western science and hearing people talk about our knowledges in ways that might not be representative of our own understandings. So I think investing in Indigenous futures at all scales is really the answer there, financially and in ways that bring resolutions to the concerns that Indigenous peoples are discussing broadly.
Excellent answer. I think what I'm hearing in your answer is that we need to reframe our research paradigms, come up with new protocols for how we're engaging with Indigenous communities and in co-production, if you want to even use those words. There is a comment here from one of our colleagues who says, one comment and point of reframing was how the language of describing invasive and native plants was within the box of colonial perspective. I have friends who work in land conservation that use this language and have educated me in regards to how some plants have been brought over from different parts of the world through previous colonial practices. I am intrigued and looking to reframe how I view my relationship to plants instead of a binary of invasive versus native.
Yeah, that's a beautiful statement. And engaging with Dr. Jennifer Grenza's work always gives me pause and makes me reflect on similar things and just expands the opportunities for how we can perceive our relations with things that we've been taught are bad, right? These are just plants.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, moving beyond Western binary thinking is a challenge. We've all been brought up in these education systems, and we see this binary playing out even in the political polarization discourse of this country. We don't like to deal with complexity. We seem to be caught up in the either or. And, you know, the genius is never in the either or, it's in the and.
Yes.
So how do we find that and in our work?
One thing that the book recommends for the and actually it's for the other. So Indigenous peoples have been discussed as the other, as things to study, of knowledge systems. We even have TEK as a word to describe the way we know and relate to our world as something other than Western perspectives. But one thing you'll see throughout the book is this concept of Indigenous elsewheres, where maybe some of the things that we're doing in the academy don't need to be done there. And maybe we need other places that are protected by the sovereignty of our reservations and our people, where we talk about these things and we grow these things, even educational systems, if you will, in these elsewhere spaces or these otherly spaces, if you will, these Indigenous spaces. So I don't think we will find all of the answers in the ivory towers, because the ivory towers are systemic structures that weren't built for us, that were built with white supremacy and racism, and still maintain that in many ways. And until we can do dramatic systemic shifts, and even at the governmental levels, to break down these structures and these systems, we can still do good work elsewhere, and we should, while we're creating the movement that we need in these spaces as well. So I think it's and we can have both. Yeah.
This is wonderful. I'm looking to see, there's one comment here. I will read this to you. It says, "Thank you, Dr. Jacobs. I appreciate how you've shown the topic of TEK is not, as so often is framed, about just one idea of Indigenous thought that can be appropriated. I have been in many spaces where non-Indigenous people talk about re-indigenizing and appropriating Indigenous knowledge directly." And this individual quotes some things from Sherman Alexie's words in the great American Indian novel, when it is finally written, all of the white people will be Indians and all of the Indians will be ghosts.
Yes.
I just wonder if you wanted to make a comment to that. I think appropriation is a real issue, so.
It is. And the bottom of that comment, to give voice to Indigenous peoples and their diverse approaches, is important, and I agree with that. And if you look at the Declaration chapter, we talk specifically about what indigenizing is and who can do that, so that it will help set that record straight a little bit. But yes, I mean, you have such a beautifully articulated statement here that's valid. And we have to, this is the point of the book. Indigenous leadership, Indigenous voices are central to challenging these narratives. And we have to do it by us, for us, and as us. No one else can speak for our perspectives. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jacobs. Last question is, how can people pre-order your book?
There is not a link yet. I just got the cover literally this week. So you're the first people to see the cover, which is exciting. Follow OSU Press, Oregon State University Press, and I would imagine in the next month or two, that link will be out. And I can also share that link back with Dr. Davis White Eyes when it comes out, so she can send it to the attendees here.
Wonderful. And I will drop in the chat for our wonderful, amazing fielding community other publications that you have done in times past. Because as you think about your research or your partnerships with NGOs, nonprofits, government agencies, I am sure that many of the works that Dr. Jacobs and her amazing colleagues, I think this wonderful collection of Indigenous thought that you are about to publish is going to really create a lot of change. I already am imagining some great conversations, even here at Fielding, about our own IRB process, around the ethics of Indigenous research, the ethics of Indigenous publishing, co-publishing. We need to have that conversation as an institution. And it's not just Fielding, it's all of higher ed. So I think we want to share our deep appreciation for you coming to us and sharing this wonderful opportunity for continued learning and growth as a collective. So thank you very much, Dr. Jacobs, and looking forward to the new book.
Meadow, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for all of the kind comments in the chat. I appreciate them.
Thank you, everyone in the fielding community. Thank you for joining us on this Indigenous Peoples Day event. Have a wonderful rest of the afternoon.